Sorry about Rogan so far. He seems more timid than I would have thought. Do you mean he means he doesn't want to go to the Epstein Island?
Very specific, illicit desire to want underage people.
Well, Kim Kardashian and her mom, Kris Jenner, have made a legal declaration under oath in the battle over her sex tape, over Kim's sex tape, and now they could be in serious hot water. So Kim Kardashian and her mom, Kris Jenner, have now filed a declaration under oath. This means this is big trouble if you lie on a document like this. But
right now, one question is circling Kris Jenner like a storm that refuses to move on. Did she mastermind a billion-dollar dynasty through pure strategy, or did she open doors that should never have been opened in the first place? That is the tension pulling so many people into this story, especially now that the Epstein conversation has resurfaced in a way that feels impossible to ignore. On one side, you have officials publicly talking about massive amounts of footage and evidence. On the other, you have major voices walking away, sounding as if there is nothing meaningful there at all. And that contradiction is exactly where the ground starts to shift, because when two versions of reality are being presented at the same time, people naturally start asking what is being left out, who benefits from the confusion, and why this all feels so carefully blurred. In this video, we're going to trace the pieces that made even Joe Rogan appear unusually stunned after that podcast discussion, then move into a real Department of Justice document that places the Kardashian sisters inside a complaint connected to a Maxwell victim filing.
Yeah, the FBI, they're reviewing, there are tens of thousands of videos of Epstein and there are hundreds of victims. And no one victim will ever get released. It's just the volume, and that's what they're going through right now. The FBI is diligently going through that. I haven't seen that statement.
From there, we are going to look at why Paris Hilton publicly turned her frustration toward Kim, why Ray J used the words federal RICO investigation on a live stream with such intensity, and why Kris Jenner's entire career blueprint begins to look less like random celebrity success and more like a calculated map once you step back far enough to see the full shape of it. And the deeper you go, the less this looks like isolated tabloid chaos, and the more it starts to resemble a pattern hiding in plain sight. Before we go any further, I know most of you already understand the basic background around Epstein and the public scandals tied to his name, so there's no reason to spend this entire opening retelling details you have likely heard 100 times before. But for anyone new here, there is a larger backstory worth knowing, and my earlier videos break down those layers in a way that will make the rest of this much easier to follow.
I'm in the files for not going.
Huh?
Yeah, I'm in the files for not going. Jeffrey Epstein was trying to meet with me.
Oh, I did see that.
Yeah, and I was like, what?
No, thanks.
Yeah.
Aren't you glad?
Yeah, but I would have never went anyway. It's like, it's not even a possibility that I would have went.
But
especially after I Googled him. I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? This was like 2017. One of my guests was trying to get me to meet him. I was like, bitch, are you high? Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
For what?
Because the real entry point today is not Epstein himself. It is Joe Rogan, and more specifically, why his name appears in the files at all. That detail sounds explosive at first, and maybe that is why it spreads so fast. But the actual story behind it points in a very different direction. Back in 2017, physicist Lawrence Krauss, someone who had previously been on Rogan's podcast, reportedly tried to arrange a connection between Rogan and Epstein. What makes that detail stand out is the timing, because this was not before the public knew who Epstein was. This was long after the 2008 conviction had already made his reputation impossible to separate from controversy. Rogan's response, according to the account, was not subtle, not polished, and not remotely interested. He allegedly shot back with, "Are you high?" and then followed it with a second reaction that made his disbelief even clearer, essentially asking what on earth Krauss thought he was talking about. And in a story filled with whispers, evasions, and carefully managed optics, that kind of immediate rejection lands differently.
Sorry about Rogan so far. He seems more timid than I would have thought. Do you mean he means he doesn't want to go to the Epstein Island? He doesn't want to go hang out with Woody Allen and a bunch of other PDF files at Epstein Island?
It is one of the rare moments here that does not feel stage managed, and that matters more than people realize. What he said next didn't sound rehearsed or cautious. It sounded like someone instantly shutting a door that should never have been opened in the first place. The kind of reaction that doesn't leave room for second thoughts or quiet follow-ups later on. There was no negotiation, no curiosity, no attempt to just hear him out. It ended right there, abruptly, almost dismissively, as if the very suggestion crossed a line that didn't need explaining. And when you place that moment beside what allegedly unfolded around others, the contrast begins to feel sharper than people are comfortable admitting. Because while Rogan stepped back immediately, reports and public discussions have pointed to figures like Bill Gates continuing interactions with Epstein after 2008, and names like Reid Hoffman appearing repeatedly across documented mentions, numbers that, whether interpreted one way or another, are difficult to ignore at face value. That difference in response doesn't automatically prove anything on its own, but it introduces a question that lingers longer than expected. Why do some people distance themselves instantly while others seem to orbit the same situation again and again? And that question becomes even harder to shake once Rogan starts speaking more openly about what he believes isn't lining up.
Very specific illicit desire to want underage people.
Well,
how do you even find out that someone's into that?
When he later addressed the situation publicly, especially around the shifting narrative involving supposed evidence, his tone had changed. Less curious, more direct, almost as if he had already decided something didn't sit right beneath the surface. Early statements from officials had described massive amounts of material, something that sounded extensive enough to suggest deeper layers waiting to be uncovered. But then, over time, that framing appeared to soften, to shrink, to quietly move in a different direction without a clear explanation for why. That kind of shift doesn't just disappear in people's minds, it creates friction, especially for someone who had already rejected any connection to Epstein years earlier without hesitation. And in that friction, Rogan began pointing out what many have been privately wondering. How does something go from overwhelming evidence to almost nothing without a clear bridge in between? The tension escalated further during that widely discussed podcast moment involving Kash Patel, where the conversation didn't feel like a revelation so much as a reversal unfolding in real time. Statements that once sounded definitive suddenly carried a different weight, and the clarity people expected seemed to dissolve into something far more uncertain.
You think people just assume it's blackmail because that is how you would blackmail someone, especially underage girls?
I think it is very possible that there could have been indirect blackmail, meaning Epstein passes it on to an intelligence service, to a corporate espionage client or something, and they use that for their own purposes.
Rogan's reaction wasn't theatrical, it was pointed, grounded in the inconsistency itself. He referenced how figures like Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and Dan Bongino had previously spoken with confidence about the existence of a client list, about transparency, about exposure. Yet after stepping into official roles, the tone appeared to shift dramatically. Fewer answers, fewer confirmations, and an almost quiet closing of the conversation altogether. That pivot is what caught attention, not because it proves a hidden truth, but because it challenges the expectation of consistency. And when consistency disappears, people don't just move on. They start connecting dots, even if those dots don't yet form a complete picture. By the time Rogan revisited the topic again, his frustration had become more visible, less filtered, shaped by a growing sense that something wasn't being addressed directly. He questioned why such strong claims were made in the first place if they were going to be walked back later, and whether the public was simply expected to accept that shift without hesitation. But the most unsettling part wasn't the criticism. It was the theory he leaned into afterward, the one that reframed everything into a much broader possibility. He suggested that, at the highest levels, influence might not operate through obvious control, but through something quieter, more strategic, access, leverage, and silence intertwined in ways that rarely surface all at once. And whether that idea holds weight or not, it introduces a lens that changes how every other piece in this story is interpreted. Because if that kind of system does exist, even partially, then what looks like contradiction might not be confusion at all. It might be design. The moment this next piece surfaces, everything you thought you understood about the story starts to rearrange itself in a way that feels both subtle and impossible to ignore. Because now, the focus shifts toward the Kardashians. But before anything else, there's an important line that has to be drawn clearly. What you're about to hear comes from a victim complaint connected to the Maxwell case, and none of the claims inside it have been proven in court. No charges have been filed against the individuals mentioned. Still, the document itself exists, publicly accessible through the Department of Justice, sitting there in plain view for anyone willing to look.
Kim Kardashian and her mom, Kris Jenner, have made a legal declaration under oath in the battle over her sex tape, over Kim's sex tape, and now they could be in serious hot water. So Kim Kardashian and her mom, Kris Jenner, have now filed a declaration under oath. This means this is big trouble if you lie on a document like this, but this all has to do with their lawsuit that they've filed against Ray J and the countersuit that Ray J filed. This all is over the Kim Kardashian and Ray J sex tape that came out from many years ago, and this continues to be a huge battle. In fact, Kris Jenner says this is haunting her every day of her life. So what is at dispute here is whether or not Kim and Kris were plotting to release this sex tape.
And that alone changes the atmosphere, because it introduces something tangible into a conversation that often feels built on fragments and speculation. But here's where it starts to become more difficult to process, because the complaint doesn't just mention distant connections, it describes what it calls a close relationship between Maxwell and the Kardashian sisters, then layers on a series of allegations that quickly move into deeply personal territory. The writing itself is uneven, at times hard to follow, almost chaotic in structure, which has led some observers to question how to interpret it properly. Yet oddly, that lack of polish is also what keeps people from dismissing it outright, because it doesn't read like something carefully constructed, it reads like something raw, and that creates a different kind of tension. As the complaint continues, it introduces claims involving identity, surrogacy, and genetic material, suggesting scenarios that feel complex enough to require serious scrutiny if they were ever to be examined in a formal setting. It references business activity, financial gain, and personal identity in ways that are difficult to neatly categorize, pulling together threads that don't immediately form a clear picture. Specific names appear in different contexts. Kylie connected to a high-value cosmetic deal, Kim tied to identity-related allegations, and Khloe and Kendall mentioned in relation to personal life events like marriages and name changes. At the same time, the complainant openly acknowledges gaps in documentation, even asking investigators to step in and verify what they can. That admission alone introduces a strange duality. On one hand, it weakens the claims. On the other, it makes the request feel less like a conclusion and more like an unresolved question waiting to be explored. And maybe that's why this document lingers in people's minds longer than expected, not because it proves something, but because it refuses to settle into a simple narrative. But the detail that continues to echo isn't any single allegation. It's the connection itself. Maxwell, a figure publicly associated with operating within elite circles of power and influence, being linked in any capacity to one of the most recognizable families in entertainment, even through an unproven complaint, introduces a layer of overlap that people can't easily ignore. Because regardless of how you interpret the specifics, there is one widely accepted idea. Maxwell's world revolved around proximity to wealth, access, and high-status environments. That was the ecosystem she moved through. And when you place that idea next to the rise of the Kardashian empire, a different kind of question begins to form. Not accusatory, but structural. How does a family transition from relative obscurity to becoming deeply embedded in nearly every major sphere of influence, celebrity, business, fashion, media, often at the same time? What pathways allowed that level of access to unfold so consistently? This is where the conversation shifts again, moving away from documents and into theory, the kind that circulates quietly but tends to stay with you once you hear it. Some observers describe what they call an access economy, a system where proximity itself becomes the most valuable currency. And within that framework, Kris Jenner is often positioned not just as a manager, but as someone who understood how to navigate and possibly leverage that system with precision. The pattern people point to isn't hidden, it's visible in relationships, partnerships, and strategic alignments that seem to place her family closer and closer to powerful figures over time. But here's the part that creates unease. When you zoom out far enough, the pattern begins to resemble something more structured than coincidence, yet not concrete enough to define with certainty. And that gray area is where the real tension lies, because it leaves you with a question that doesn't resolve easily. At what point does networking, ambition, and calculated positioning begin to look like something else entirely? And why does that question feel harder to answer the longer you sit with it? As this story pushes further into uncomfortable territory, there's a moment where everything seems to pause, almost as if it's forcing you to separate what is confirmed from what is being interpreted. Because despite how often these names are mentioned together, there is no official, documented connection placing the Kardashians at Epstein's island. None. What exists instead is something far more ambiguous, a mix of a single victim complaint, widespread online theories, and a web of elite relationships that people are trying to piece together in real time. And that distinction matters because without it, the entire conversation risks collapsing into assumption rather than observation. But even with that boundary in place, there's still something that continues to pull attention back in, the idea that patterns can exist without immediately proving intent. And once you start looking through that lens, the situation becomes less about a single claim and more about how multiple threads seem to move in parallel without fully intersecting in a way that's easy to explain. That's where Joe Rogan's perspective adds a different kind of weight, not because it confirms anything, but because it reframes how people interpret the bigger picture. He didn't describe the system as broken or chaotic. In fact, he suggested the opposite, that it might be functioning exactly as designed, shielding those at the highest levels while maintaining just enough transparency to keep the public engaged but never fully informed. It's a perspective that doesn't rely on proving every allegation. Instead, it focuses on structure, on incentives, on how influence can quietly reinforce itself over time. And when that idea is placed alongside what's often called Hollywood's access economy, the comparison starts to take shape in a way that feels less coincidental. Different environments, different industries, but potentially similar mechanics operating underneath. Connections, proximity, opportunity, all moving in ways that aren't always visible until someone steps back far enough to notice the repetition. Then there are the overlapping timelines and associations that people keep circling back to, not as proof, but as points of curiosity that seem too consistent to ignore entirely. The Kardashian family's rapid rise aligning with a period when Epstein's legal situation was already publicly known. The presence of figures like Alex Spiro being mentioned in broader discussion connected to these files. Names from completely different industries, music, fashion, tech, appearing within the same social orbit, crossing paths at events, partnerships, and private gatherings. None of this forms a definitive conclusion on its own, and it's important to keep that clarity intact. But taken together, it creates a kind of map, not a straight line, but a network of intersections that people continue trying to interpret. And maybe that's why this conversation refuses to fade, because it doesn't hinge on one explosive revelation. It builds slowly, through accumulation, through repeated proximity that becomes harder to dismiss the more often it appears. And then the narrative shifts again, this time toward Paris Hilton, and the tone changes almost instantly. Because when her name surfaced in connection with the latest document releases, the reaction described by observers wasn't subtle. It was immediate, defensive, almost urgent. According to commentary surrounding the moment, Paris began questioning why the attention seemed to focus so heavily on her, while others, particularly Kim Kardashian, were not facing the same level of scrutiny. That reaction, whether interpreted as frustration or something deeper, introduced a new layer to the story, one that isn't about documents or timelines, but about perception and imbalance. And it doesn't stop there, because accounts tied to the documentary Surviving Jeffrey Epstein describe a moment where Ghislaine Maxwell allegedly identified Paris at a social event and expressed interest in making an introduction. Even paraphrased, even unverified in a legal sense, that detail lingers in a different way, because it shifts the question from who was involved to something far more unsettling. How often did proximity alone place people into situations they didn't fully understand at the time? And if that's the case, then the real story might not just be about individuals, but about an environment where being in the right room could mean far more than anyone realized in the moment. As this story reaches its most uncomfortable edge, the narrative around Paris Hilton begins to feel less like background noise and more like a pressure point that's been building for years. Paris has publicly denied knowing Ghislaine Maxwell, even though photographs place them in the same social environments, at the same events, moving through the same high-profile circles. And on the surface, that contradiction might seem easy to explain. Celebrity spaces are crowded, overlapping, often chaotic. But then Kim Kardashian enters the frame in a way that subtly shifts the entire dynamic. Because before the fame, before the billion-dollar empire, Kim was right there beside Paris, styling her, assisting her, appearing quietly in the background of photos that at the time didn't seem important. Yet in hindsight, those moments start to feel different, almost like early access points into a world that few people ever reach. And according to how some insiders describe it, that proximity wasn't just incidental, it was strategic, a stepping stone into increasingly powerful circles that kept expanding over time. What makes this more layered is the emotional contrast that follows. Paris watched that transformation happen in real time, watched Kim rise, watched her influence multiply, watched her become one of the most recognizable figures on the planet. And at the same time, Paris found herself facing waves of public scrutiny that didn't seem to distribute evenly. That imbalance, whether perceived or real, is where the tone reportedly changes. Because when people close to the situation describe Paris reaching a breaking point, they don't frame it as sudden. They describe it as something that had been building quietly, a growing frustration over who was being questioned and who seemed to move untouched. Some now claim she has begun speaking more openly behind the scenes, potentially sharing perspectives she had kept private for years. And whether that's accurate or not, it introduces a new layer of uncertainty, because it suggests there may be conversations happening out of view that could eventually reshape how this entire timeline is understood. Meanwhile, Kim's response has taken a very different form: structured, legal, controlled. Her actions toward Ray J, following his live stream comments, including references to serious-sounding allegations, quickly moved into the realm of lawsuits and countersuits, turning public claims into a legal battleground rather than an open-ended discussion. Ray J's response, calling it a calculated public relations move, only added more friction to an already complicated situation. And then there's the detail that continues to linger beneath all of this: the idea that the broader investigation hasn't been officially closed, only gone quiet. That silence is interpreted in different ways depending on who you ask. But for some, it echoes a familiar pattern. Less noise, not because there's nothing left to examine, but because whatever remains is being handled away from public view. It's not confirmation of anything, but it's enough to keep the tension alive, enough to keep people watching for what might surface next. And then, almost like a final, unresolved thread, there's the claim, circulating quietly, that somewhere within all of this, there exists a file with Kim's name attached to it. No verified release, no confirmed contents, just a suggestion that something may be sitting behind closed doors, waiting, or perhaps never intended to be seen at all. Whether that idea holds any truth is impossible to say from the outside, but its presence alone adds weight to everything that came before it. Because by this point, the story is no longer about one allegation or one connection. It's about a network of moments, reactions, and unanswered questions that refuse to settle into a clear conclusion. And maybe that's why this continues to pull people in, because it leaves just enough unresolved to make you wonder what's still missing, what hasn't been said, and whether the full picture is something we're meant to see at all. Comment below with what you think is really going on. Leave a like if this gave you chills, and subscribe, plus turn on notifications if you want to see more Hollywood secrets.